Hey guys, it's great to see everybody. And I'm excited to start a meat conference with seafood. And especially seafood where we've got like the traditional side of the house and then the technical side. So I'm I'm Larissa Zimberoff. I write about food and technology. I'm working on a book that will be out fall 2020 on future foods. I'm really excited. It's also really hard. But I'm going to start with the panel and have them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what they do, and then we'll jump into questions, and at the end we'll have some open Q&A. So Lauran she came up from San Diego. She works for BlueNalu.
Hi, I'm Lauran Madden. I am the principal scientist at BlueNalu, and I manage the R&D project portfolio, including cell line development for a variety of seafood species, the media optimization, and product development.
Hi, I'm Pallevi Srivastva. I'm from Wild Type. I lead the media and process development team, and what my team does is we work on media optimization, so defining the chemical culture media that the salmon cells will grow in, and also on scaling up.
My name is Chuck Anderson. I was in the seafood industry for about 35 years. Started as a fish cutter and went into the supermarket business because I wanted to get out of fish. They kept pulling me back in. So I ended up becoming vice president of seafood and then perishables for Ahold USA. I also served in a procurement role for H-E-B in Texas. So I've bought and procured and merchandised seafood in a number of probably 20 states. And then most recently, we have a startup company that uses bioelectrical impedance to measure the health of animals and fish.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mariliis Holm, and I'm the Director of Food Science at Finless Foods. And Finless Foods is a cell-based startup that produces and develops seafood without the catch.
Great, thanks. So I read this really interesting stat, which is that while aquaculture growth of fish and sales have been growing year over year at about 6%, marine capture has stayed relatively the same. So we've got aquaculture growing, but it hasn't yet affected wild fish, showing the need, like if we want to stop capturing wild fish, we need to do something. So I thought we could ask Chuck, or start with Chuck, asking him, I'm curious, like if you can talk to the global changes in our fish sales and why this hasn't like affected wild catch yet.
Gotcha. So wild capture fisheries capture about 90 million metric tons of fish a year. That number has been pretty steady since about 1980. In 1980 is about when modern aquaculture started. Before 1980, you had some rainbow trout farms and some carp in China, but that was about it. And in the 80s, salmon started in Norway, shrimp started in Ecuador, and then it really bloomed. So in 1981, it was 9% of the seafood sold in the United States was farm-raised. Today, it's about 52% is farm-raised. And one of the issues with why we're still catching so much wild is because there's a lot of negative press about farmed. Farmed is a four-letter word when it comes to seafood, not for meat and produce. So a lot of people, that's why the price of wild fish has gone so high, because there's so much demand for it, because people are like, oh, farm fish is bad. And it's really what we need to do, to get us over the hump until cellular-based fish are ready to go.
That's really interesting, and it takes me to a question that I had hoped to ask at the end of it, but if consumer acceptance of farmed is so low, what's the conversation around consumer acceptance and education around cell-based?
It's the same issue. It's education, whether you're talking about. and it will happen. These things are slow, and aquaculture is starting to gain traction. There's certain areas, especially on the West Coast, Boston, that's still a real four-letter word. But I'm working with a lot of retailers, and they're starting to understand that farm-raised fish is actually just better quality. The handling is so much better. Instead of a fish being caught in 70-degree water, in 70-degree temperatures, cut on board the deck, takes 4 hours to get it into the hold, takes another 48 hours to get down to temperature. The fish then comes back after 7 to 10 days. Then you fillet it, and then you ship it. It's not very good fish. And that's one of the issues. So farm-raised fish is usually caught and handled very beautifully. And that's one of the benefits that you're going to have with cellular-based fish is you can handle it perfectly. It's going to have no pathogens to start with, and you're going to be even better than farm-raised when it comes to quality.
Gotcha. So the three companies that are the cell-based are all working on different types of fish, and I was thinking we could talk about how your companies decided to choose that fish, how difficult it is because scientific knowledge is pretty limited on fish versus animals, and so let's go down the line and starting with Lauran about how BlueNalu selected their fish, what it's like to work on fish lines where you don't have, tons of research, and then also like you're trying to make it from scratch.
Yeah, so lots of questions in that. So BlueNalu, we actually have more of a platform technology, and we have a kind of pipeline of species in the works. And the idea is to select species that have a lot of pressure and cannot be done with other technologies such as aquaculture. So species that are endangered, overfished, but there is still a consumer demand that cannot be met by any other method. And interestingly, with these species, there's also very little basic scientific research done. So for example, one of our species is mahi-mahi. We closely work with academic labs that have experience with that species, try to gain as much information as possible, from studies on wild-caught fish or from labs that do analysis, and really understand each species' individual needs when we're developing the cell lines.
Great. So, and partnering with academia, does that mean like you have to protect your IP, but with academia it's open source, right?
Yeah, so when we partner with people, usually it's a give and take. So they have a specific skill. For example, a lot of the labs we work with, maybe they're doing feed studies, they're doing genetic studies, they're looking at biological diversity or how the fish acts in nature. And then we can also help them with, how do they work from a cellular level. So there's give and take with the different specialties.
That's great. And so do you see a future where you might be on a study that would be like a part the academic and part BlueNalu scientists?
Yes, definitely. We definitely actively seek out different academic collaborations, where is that there's a synergy in the specialties.
Great. So Pallevi, can you tell us about what Wildtype is doing?
Yeah. So Wildtype is working on creating salmon, and the first question was why the fish that you're working with. I think there are most of the reasons that Lauran said about having an overfished environmental impact. One of those reasons that we chose salmon was because of that. It's so much overfished. It's, I think, the second largest piece of meat that is consumed in the United States. So just to have an alternate source for consumers. And the second reason, I think, being a food company, it's exciting to work with a fish or a meat that's so versatile because you can have an array of products with salmon. You can have it as a lox, you can have it as minced, you can also have it as steak. So
I'm so glad lox is being watched out for.
So yeah, just as a food company, you can have all these different options as a product. Your second question was about how we understand the
balancing that there isn't as much scientific literature about fish.
Yeah, so I think the first thing Justin and Arya, the founders of the company, did was to have on our team some of these people are rare, fish developmental biologists. So we have some of our colleagues who have done this, and not many people in the world study fish. So that definitely helps. But at the same time, it's an ongoing process of, there are no cell lines you cannot buy a fish cell line. So you have to isolate your own cell and then study them and characterize them both on genetic level as well as in terms of feed. So it's an ongoing process, and we learn something, we apply and do experiments to figure out what we learned, is it true or not. In terms of collaborations, I think we do collaborate with academic institutes. There's one that we're going to do soon, and there are many, I don't think there are many labs, or at least I'm not aware of many labs that also work on fish specific nutrients, and so we'll be soon collaborating with one of those labs in Calgary that is working to figure out growth factors, which are these specialized proteins that you need for cells to grow. And in terms of the give and take of the information, they have this, they are specialized in working on growth factors, and we have certain cell lines that we have developed and know how they function and characterize them. So that's the information back and forth that will happen there.
Great, thanks. A quick question to Chuck, and then I'm going to hop to Mariliis. So salmon is one of the biggest fish categories. Is there room for aquaculture, wild and cell-based?
Absolutely. So when you talk about species to grow from a market perspective, I look at two things. One is consumer demand, and two is going to be cost and what's the market price. So if you look at something like mahi, I don't know if that's the best one to do. One is there is a pretty good wild stock, but there's also a lot of farming going to come in mahi. Mahi is one of the easiest fish to farm. They can grow a 1.5 pound plate-sized mahi in 3 months. So it's almost like the chicken. It's one of the fastest growing fish. So that one I don't think is going to be a great long-term. I think the two wild ones I'd look at would be bluefin tuna, because that's really hard to do in captivity. Also Chilean sea bass. Those are deep water fish. They're selling for $25 a pound, and it's a 1,500 feet deep fish. That's where they catch them. So you have to mimic that pressure. So that would be a hard one. So those two I would do on the wild side. The other ones I would do are shrimp and salmon. People say, why don't you do snapper and grouper? They're very popular, but they can be farmed. And also shrimp and salmon that's the chicken and beef of the seafood industry. Yep. Shrimp is number one, 4 pounds per capita. So a quarter of all the seafood sold in the United States is shrimp. And about 15% of all of the seafood sold in the United States is salmon. So you've already got, people know what salmon is. You don't have to educate them about what mahi is or what tilefish or whatever it might be. So I would go for those four from a market perspective.
Great, and so this is actually perfect for Mariliis, who's focused on flavor and taste. Talk about the challenges. And Finless is working on tuna, which is, according to Chuck, a smart fish.
Yeah, I'll start with the first question, which fish we're working with. So Finless Foods has chosen bluefin tuna to be our first species that we were come to the market with. And it was actually a pretty straightforward decision-making process. We had 4 reasons why to choose bluefin. So bluefin, first of all, is an endangered species. So if we look at the 1960s data, we see that the quantity of fish that is out there has decreased by 96%. So that's a very big decrease. Secondly, bluefin tuna is one of the most expensive seafood products that is out there. One fish can go up to costing us $3 million, which happened last year. And thirdly, bluefin tuna is a species that people know very well and have a high demand for. So it's a high quality brand out there, and people seek that specific flavor and texture profile. And last but not least, bluefin tuna also hasn't successfully been aquacultured yet. It's a very difficult species to grow in captivity. And for example, an anecdotal story, for 10 years, the aquaculture facility tried to cultivate this species, and what happened was that the fish died after they only turned 3 years old, which is a juvenile age, or it's a young age for the fish. And they figured out only after 10 years that they haven't been feeding them enough DHA, so oil for the vision to develop. So what actually happened with the species was that they didn't get enough oils for their vision, they went blind, they couldn't see their food, and then they died. So it took them 10 years to figure this out. So it's a very complicated species to actually cultivate.
That is so sad. Well, so one of the things that you're working on is flavor, and one of the things I find very interesting that Chuck sort of pointed out a little, or actually, sorry, it was Pallevi, which is that salmon is one of the biggest in the United States. are your companies focused on the United States? And then as flavor is different needs of flavor around the world, how are you handling that?
Absolutely. So I had the wonderful chance to visit Japan for the first time in May this year, and I had the chance to eat what people, in the world say the best quality bluefin tuna, and that's the stock that comes from Japan. And I actually discovered to my surprise that the flavor profile of a Japanese bluefin tuna and the one that I have consumed here in America is vastly different. So what I discovered was that in Japan, when I tasted the fish, it was more of a texture and a mouthfeel experience versus being a flavor experience, which happens more in the United States. So in Japan, there was almost no taste. It was more of a fatty and a texturized mouthfeel, versus here in the United States, the fish meat has a bit of a more metallic taste and a bit of a sour taste. So that was an interesting discovery.
What are some of the things, we spoke a little bit about algae, and obviously it's like picking up in other ways, algae in the food system, but can you talk about what your levers you're playing with to do that?
Definitely. So algae, if we think about any marine product that is out there, algae is the bottom of the food chain. So it's the source that everything comes from. And all of the seafood that we consume has that specific characteristic of marine flavor, and that inherently comes from algae. So algae oils give that characteristic seafood taste, and that's something we're definitely taking advantage of while we develop our products at Finless.
Great. So we talked about one of the things that happens later in the fish, but in the beginning, one of the roadblocks often talked about in cell-based is the medium, and we'll start with Pallevi. The challenges of creating a supply chain that doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So my background has always been in mammalian cell, and there are so many different kinds of media that you can use to grow a mammalian cell line, but I was surprised to find that there are no fish-specific media. So the two problems with working on media is, in a food industry, you're working with pharmaceutical grade media, and we don't need that much of purity, and we probably also do not need all of those different things that are present in there. So there are many amino acids and vitamins that may not be relevant for your species that you're growing. So it's important to just tailor it down and make it more lean for what you need. And at this time, everything that's available off the shelf has a bunch of different things that may not be relevant to you. So I think it's thinking about supply chain. We have to think differently about creating media for a cell-based food product, because we don't have to we can go for a food supplier, or if you think about salts in the media, a very good example is you can go to the grocery store and get salt, which is sodium chloride, and it is present in your media. So think differently about how we are creating media and who we should go to as a supplier to source those ingredients, as I think that's different in optimization of and that requires a little bit of training, because as a scientist, you're used to thinking about media in a very narrow, defined way that you're trained, but the game has changed, and it's not disease work that you're doing, it's not vaccines that you're making food. So the ingredient that goes into the food should be different and sourced differently.
Thanks. Lauran, can you speak to this topic as well, the medium as a roadblock to, you've got this pharmaceutical supply chain that doesn't really work in food because it's too expensive.
Mm-hmm. So particularly as a supply chain, so it's interesting if you think about, our current food supply chain. Actually, most, like aquaculture, you start with actually the fish feed. So there are actually existing supply chains of all of the potential nutrients that would be used to grow, for example, the traditional animals. And particularly in salmon aquaculture, there's several decades worth of research on optimizing fish feeds for optimal conversion efficiency to actually grow those animals. So I think there is a lot of existing technologies there is an existing supply chain that is a lower grade than the pharmaceutical grade, and the question is, the nutrients or other things required to grow an entire animal or the things that are used to grow mammalian cells are much different from what's required in a fish cell. As Mariliis mentioned, the different fatty acid requirements, there's different essential amino acid requirements depending on if it's an omnivore, it's a carnivore, what kind of salt levels are present, because seawater has a much higher salt content than other animals. And so these are just all like slight differences that can make a big impact on your media efficiency.
Gotcha. This one's for Chuck. In aquaculture, a lot of the complaints is that they're being fed real fish. And if Lauran mentioned that we know a lot from aquaculture, but you can't, to bake cell-based fish, you eventually have to leave the fish supply chain, right? So is there any movement in the aquaculture field to not use fish as feed?
Absolutely. Number one, the price keeps going up. The forage fish, the menhaden, sardines, the things that are used for fish meal and for fish oil are getting scarcer. The prices are going much higher. So there's an economic reason as well as an environmental reason to make that change. So there's folks looking at black soldier fly larvae. They're also looking at algae. They've already been doing soy, which has some limitations. One of the ones that just won last week at Fish 2.0 is barley. They're looking at using barley, which is even less expensive and has some better attributes than soy does. There's a fair bit of protein in that. So there's a lot of work. That's probably the most active area of investment and development in the aquaculture world.
Great. I thought we could talk about some of the scientific challenges in growing cell-based seafood and what drew you to joining this sector.
So I can more talk about the food science side of the company as I'm part of that team. So the challenges we have, as much as I know on the cell side of things, is that, of course, we need a media that is free from any animal products.
Yeah, no, what drew you to, like, what were some of the challenges that drew you to the company? What are you excited to try to, you worked for an algae company before this, and so what kind of excited you about the field, the sector?
Okay, sorry, I got it now. So before joining Finless Foods, I had the chance to co-found and work for Non-Food, which makes algae-based protein bars. So we use different algae and marine ingredients in our product. And it was very complimentary for me when I joined Finless Foods to leverage this knowledge of algae and the nutritional profile of algae, the flavor profile of algae, and to complement that in the development of bluefin tuna. Because as I mentioned earlier, algae is the bottom of the food chain and tuna is the top predator, so I almost closing the loop between the two. And algae also can provide the color for the tuna itself, and then, of course, the flavor and then the nutritional profile. So I see very big potential in introducing that as an ingredient to the cell-based, but also to the aquaculture.
Thanks. Let's hop to Lauran, since you've got the mic. What were some of the challenges in growing seafood that attracted you and had you leave your past employment, which was more like medical related?
Yeah, so I have quite a lot of training actually in 3D tissue engineering specifically for muscle cell applications. So both my Ph.D. and postdoc were in muscle cell biology and creating novel three-dimensional structures for regenerative medicine applications. And I was actually at a 3D bioprinting company and saw, the ad for BlueNalu come up, and I said, hey, this is, very doable. The basic cell biology is there, making the product is there. The biofarm has a lot of technologies that
I love that you're like, that seems doable.
Yeah, can scale up, and it's a matter of putting all the pieces together and really creating this kind of new manufacturing style. So as a trained engineer, I said, hey, that would be really fun. Like, to do this really cool new thing, but also it's solving a very large immediate problem in the food supply chain, and particularly in seafood, you have supply chain issues, you have this increasing demand, you have all these pollutants in the water, and you're really affecting multiple areas of human health, environmental health that are really wide-reaching.
Great. Pallevi, can you tell us what brought you to change fields?
Yeah. many of my reasons are very similar to Lauran's, about how I was just admiring the problem, the scientific problem this is, the limited knowledge in fish biology. I have this strange tendency of putting myself out of my comfort zone. All my training always has been on mammalian and specifically cancer cells, and fish is nothing I knew about. So I said, why not just learn about it, make yourself uncomfortable in the process, do something cool. The other part of it was, this is such an enormous problem that you need people from all these different scientific backgrounds, so cell biologists, tissue engineers, people from media, food science. It's like convergence of all these brilliant minds and how each person works or field works. You get to understand the perspective that each field has, and that's very interesting to me. So those are the reasons I joined.
Great, thanks. So one of the things that the roadblocks that are often spoken about are, there's medium, but another is, especially for red meat, is the scaffolding. Fish is different, but I hope that you could talk about that, even like just sort of pondering if you wanted to make use of scaffolding, or the conversations that you've had about growing the fish. It'll be for all of you. So, Pallevi, go for it.
Okay. So how do we think about scaffolding?
Well, are you planning to use scaffolding? Do you need to use it? Do fish need that?
Yeah, so we do use scaffolding, and this is not my area. Maybe Lauran would be better to answer it, but I can say what we do at Wildtype. So we do use scaffolding to grow our cells, and the reason is you want the cells to have this anchorage that they can use and then find connections to each other and permeate, and then ultimately form all these different kind of specialized or differentiated cells, so fat or muscle, and then ultimately convert that piece of scaffold into a real piece of meat. So we do use scaffolds, yes.
Great. Lauran, can you talk to us about whether or not the company has chosen to do fish need, we talked about it on the phone that fish don't necessarily need scaffolding.
Yeah, BlueNalu has chosen to go in a scaffold-free technology. So we currently make all our 3D samples without a scaffold. This is motivated by a few different factors. One is really keeping the integrity of the product to maximize the cell content and decrease any, what would naturally be occurring in the fish muscle. The second one is time. So if you think about a continuous manufacturing process, for example, if I'm making cookies, I probably want to make several million cookies a day. So if I have a scaffold and I have to incubate my cells for days or weeks, this actually creates a throughput issue in your manufacturing strategy. And also for a continuous process, if you think about pasta or anything else, you might want to be able to continuously make this product, form the product, package the product, treat the product, to make your kind of manufacturing process as smooth as possible.
Interesting. And you, Lauran, you mentioned that your end product will be extruded, correct?
We are currently looking at a lot of the extrusion technology similar to the food, currently in the food industry, with the kind of part of the name of the game is not reinventing the wheel. So food technology is actually quite advanced in all of the different products. Think of all the shapes, sizes, forms of food products you currently get, and the technologies are already there to make a wide variety of shapes, sizes, forms, think about a layered cake. There's all these methods that are already available and in the existing food industry toolbox.
Great, thanks. Mariliis, bluefin tuna in my mind needs a scaffold, and then is there flavor, is there not flavor conveyed by that? Can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So Finless Foods has decided that the first product we'll come to the market with will be a spicy tuna roll. So there's some texture that is present there. And we're looking into different avenues, but something we are exploring at the moment and very interested in is stereolithography. So it's a methodology to use lasers to solidify gelatin-like or gelatin ingredients that would form the scaffold we want the cells to grow into. So currently this technology is used more in the pharmaceutical industry, more for organ printing. But once the technology becomes more affordable, then the food part, so such as Finless Foods and other companies could look into that and take advantage of this technology.
Wow, cool, awesome. Are you working at all with Geltor? I guess, sorry.
Definitely not at the moment on the food science front where I am. I don't know actually on the cell side.
That's
of
okay,
things.
sorry. So Chuck, your new startup is helping food processors know where their fish is coming from and like whether it's fresh or frozen and how old it is. How could that technology help these cell-based companies?
Okay, well, I appreciate the opportunity to pitch my product, but let me jump on the question you guys were talking first, if you don't mind. So I like the fact that you're looking at extruded salmon products. Seafood is mostly sold, 2/3 of all seafood sold is sold in restaurants. 2/3 of all the seafood sold is sold semi-prepared, either ready to cook or ready to eat, because consumers, especially in the United States and Canada, don't know how to handle seafood. They're afraid of it. That's why 50% of the food is sold in food service, 50% retail, but in fish, it's 70% that's actually sold in restaurants. So I think there's plenty of business out there. You don't need to worry about growing a perfect tuna steak or a perfect salmon fillet, because salmon burgers or portions, they go into a lot of different things.
So more ready to eat,
yeah,
like
ready to
pre-packed.
ready to cook and ready to eat, and that's where most of the sales are anyway.
Gotcha.
All right, so now back to the pitch. So we have a technology which uses bioelectrical impedance analysis, or sends electricity through the cells of an animal. So we've been working mostly on the seafood side, and that's why the company hired me. And we do both post-processing, so like QA inspections. So instead of having an organoleptic inspection by a USDC inspector or some highly trained person, you can use this machine to measure the quality of a piece of fish just by touching it. It takes about a second, and it sends electricity through, and we're basically measuring the cells. We're measuring the resistance and the reactants. So since we're measuring cells, we're also doing live fish, so we're doing work with aquaculture now. We're also working with chicken farms, and they use it for kind of weeding out the best practices. So they may have 2 different tanks, and one tank has a higher pH than the other, and they can measure the fish every week, and the fish that are healthier, okay, let's do the 7.4 pH. And then they have a different feed trial, which one's better. So they use it to weed out the best practices. And we're thinking you might be able to do the same thing with cell culture as well. You wouldn't use this machine. We have different form factors. This one is for scallops and shrimp. We could also make it smaller than this. You could use 2 sewing needles and do a very small cell culture. And then you would use a continuous monitor, so it would just measure every hour or something like that. And you could have 2 different, batches, 2 different reactors, and one has a slightly different media, which one's growing faster, growing healthier. We can also do fat, protein, and waters if that's something you're trying to achieve.
So we kind of see a future where we have wild-caught, aquaculture, and cell-based. We already know that the current market of aquaculture and wild, the consumers are would prefer wild, although we may be just speaking about sort of the higher-end consumers. Is there anybody like working on a technology that would enable a consumer like me to see the fish, test it, and know what was in it?
We have a capability of putting this on an iPhone, so it would give you the quality. It wouldn't necessarily tell you what's in it, so it wouldn't tell you if there's mercury in the fish or something like that, but it would tell you the quality of the fish. We actually have a glove we've designed, and it has 4 electrodes on the fingers, and you can touch the fruit in the produce department and determine how ripe it is. So there's a lot of different consumer applications down the road for our technology.
And this might be for my other panelists, but as you work on these cell-based seafood, and you're doing things that have a lot of IP around it, but consumers want to know, and they want a clean label, they want transparency. How do you balance achieving that in like a protected environment?
So as David mentioned earlier, David from Memphis Meats earlier in the morning mentioned the coalition, the AMPS Innovation. So I see that as one of the big information providers for the general public and all the other relevant stakeholders. So that's a go-to information center where general public and anyone who's interested can go in order to understand what we are doing, how we're doing, and why we're doing what we do.
Lauran, what do you think about consumers knowing everything you're doing versus just knowing enough that they'll be comfortable eating it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Part of our regulatory strategy is really thinking about, who are all the people that are going to be concerned. Obviously, there's the FDA, who is in charge of the regulatory, and, we'll work openly with them as needed as this framework is developed and really give all the information necessary for the governmental. And then there's also different NGOs or consumer groups that, they've started asking a lot of questions. They go to the FDA, ask questions. And I think right now it's figuring out, what information do you need? What are your concerns? And really trying to addressing and being honest and open about what we're doing. And I think a lot of maybe early on it's too early we're still doing media optimization. Maybe we don't exactly know. And so I'm hoping as the industry progresses, we'd be able to become more and more transparent. And once there's a product on the market, anything that's not critical IP, we're hopeful that we can be transparent with the public.
Pallevi, do you want to add to that?
No, I would just want to say that what Lauran was saying about transparency and building trust with consumers to get to consumer acceptance, I think transparency is very important. And we take it very seriously to make our product really safe. We do the testings to assure that the things that we are making are safe enough, but there are a lot of things that we don't even know at this point, and we're doing research as we are making the product. So it's very hard to be completely transparent at this stage, but the intent is definitely there.
Maybe Chuck can answer this, but I, as a consumer that sometimes eats fish, I look at the Monterey Bay Aquarium and I see what they recommend. Do you see, maybe it's the Alliance, maybe it's a conversation with the Monterey Bay Aquarium. What do you see being possible?
Oh, I see cell-based fish being green on all the measures, whether it's Monterey Bay or whoever's, New England Aquarium, whoever's making those ratings. So I think it's a great opportunity. But it's all about transparency, like you said, and about education. It's going to take a lot of education. Before this panel, I called half a dozen buyers or directors for major food service chains and some retail chains. And there was a couple that were somewhat acceptance of this, but there was one in the Midwest who was like, we would not touch it. It's too controversial, wouldn't put it out there for our customers. I have no interest in it. I said, well, what if it's the same price as the other products? He said, it doesn't matter, I will not put it out there. So there's a lot of education that needs to happen, but it will happen. Because the younger generations, wants clean labels. They want products that are sustainable, responsibly made. And you just look at the milk section. When I started in the grocery business, there was 8 doors of milk. Well, there's still 8 doors of milk, but now there's 2 doors of cow milk, and there's 2 doors of lactose-free, and there's 2 doors of almond milk, and a bunch of different products. So, consumers can and will change. So it will happen. It's just a matter of time, but it's going to be a lot of transparency and a lot of education.
Yeah. I'm going to open it up soon to audience Q&A, and we can go back and forth. So if you've got questions, start thinking about them. Mariliis, I feel like we didn't really hit on the how do we do a fish that appeals globally. Wild fish is that's the one thing you got, right? And it's sold regionally. If you have bluefin tuna, you're not going to have 10 types of it, or maybe eventually you are. Right? 1 type, 10 types? How do you make a product for everybody?
So actually, inside of the company, we had a bit of a turbulence in terms of deciding, do we do this flavor profile and texture for the American market, or do we do for the Japanese market, or do we try to do a hybrid that is good and palatable and likable for everyone? But I personally believe in segmented markets. So I believe, and we've decided to go for both strategies. So we are developing different versions of the flavor profile to really cater for everyone's need. And I feel like the more globalized the world becomes, people want diversity in their food, and that's a positive opportunity to have that different experience from the same nutritional value, for example.
Gotcha. One of the things Pat Brown said to me was that he wanted his product to be healthier better for us than what it was replacing. And so for that end, they also put vitamins and nutrients into the burger. Are there plans to do things like that with fish?
I'm personally very excited about all the omega-3s that are in, I mean, I keep talking about algae, but it's the food source for the fish in the nature. So definitely algae oils and different amounts of omega-3s and the balance, because in our diet, we just consume too much omega-6 anyway. So having that from the fish source and our cell-based fish is going to be a major nutrition provider in the future.
Pallevi?
Yeah, that definitely is the intent. And one thing I can say is, like Chuck was saying, cell-based seafood is definitely going to be higher quality than what's out there in the market. So it will not have any contaminants. In terms of added benefits of nutrients, yes, we want to have that. And in terms of media optimization, I'm thinking about it. You can have it in different flavors and try to improve your flavors, because omega-3 oils also add to the flavor of the fish, the fattiness of it. So yeah, that's something that we are considering and working on.
Lauran, anything to add?
I think one interesting thing about particularly the seafood industry is that, it's a supply-driven model, and what we are able to do is change it to a demand-driven model. So if the consumer wants a product that has high omega-3s, high calcium, no mercury, that's something we can give the consumer. And so I think there's a little bit of a paradigm shift where we're no longer restricted by what the supply is. We can really provide the consumer with what they demand.
Interesting. This sort of goes back to the supply chain of the nutrients and ingredients that will go into making your fish, but one of the things a guy from Beyond Meat said at the Good Food Institute conference a couple months ago was that the sodium level was so high because of the ingredient supply chain. You guys are going to be looking for sort of a low-cost ingredient supply chain, so how do you balance making a better product that still has maybe high sodium levels?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit different in, the plant-based model where you're taking kind of complex nutrient sources and then they're doing a lot of manufacturing processes to make all the individual ingredients. Here, the cells are really controlled by the environment they're grown in. So if you look at, for example, if you take a piece of fish flesh and you measure the different salts, these are things that we can actually replicate in the media environment. And so I don't see challenges in actually creating at least the same or even a healthier product to that extent.
Gotcha. So, but on a clean label, I'd want to see organic this, organic that, but that's expensive. Like, how do you? It's sort of like the quality of your ingredients to start with. Should I care as a consumer? Anybody can answer.
Can you say that one more time? Sorry.
I care about the quality of my ingredients that go into an end product, right? And so I look for organic, I look for okay, there's a famous bar maker that's in the East Bay, I won't say its name, and all the ingredients are organic. There's one ingredient that's not, it's their protein isolates, soy protein isolates. So I kind of think that sucks. Like, why make an organic product if it doesn't have this second ingredient isn't organic? So how important is it, the ingredients that you use to make the seafood?
It is, because we're aiming to get a healthy, high quality product. So something that's making the product or the key ingredient should be also a high quality source or material in there. So in terms of labeling, because the regulation is not clear on it, I don't know how it will be labeled, but for wild type, I can say we are very, we want to be very honest, and we'll label the packaging in a way that clearly describes what we're using, and so it's very clear to the consumers what they're having and if it's good quality according to them or not. So the transparency will be there.
Okay, great. Does anybody else want to say? Yep.
Yes, so what I'm aiming to do in my work is all the ingredients come from the food science side of things. I'm currently looking into non-GMO verified, so to make sure that whatever we come with the market with is definitely non-GMO origin.
Great, thanks. Chuck?
Let me jump on that.
Yeah.
You're not going to get organic standards because it's not part of the way it's raised by USDA. So that's not going to happen.
Well, but this fish could be different, right? It could be organic ingredients that go into making it. I don't think they're going to do that, but there could be.
Yeah, even the best aquaculture farms are not able to get an organic label. They have one in Europe, but nothing in the United States, and it's very controversial. I don't see that as a way, but I do think you want to talk about your ingredients. You want to talk about how this is. I think you should change your name for the company instead of Wild Type. No, this is better than Wild, right? Because it really will be better than Wild. Yeah.
Better than Wild Type.
So
There's another Wild Type guy here, right? Yeah.
Sorry about that. Or also, I might start my own company called Better Than Wild.
Any questions from the audience? There's a microphone up in the front, although I just see the stand. Alex is going to grab one.
There
Come
are
on
two
up.
mic runners, so if you have a question, Daniel could bring a mic to you, and Hikaru, I'll give you this. Okay, thank you.
Hello. Hi, this is a question for actually the companies that are culturing the cells. And one of the problems that you have with the cells is you don't have enough people kind of working on it. So are you interested in releasing some of your cell lines out to academics in order just to have more people work on it, rather than having the academics just working on zebrafish or carp or goldfish? Is there any possibility of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I was mentioning about the collaboration that we are going to have with one of the universities or academic labs, was just that we have characterized and developed these cell lines. It's only helpful if we share it and let others work on it and get more minds working and thinking about it. So that's the intent there, yes.
And I also know that GFI sponsors a lot of grants every year, and it has to be open source. So I think it's just more people going that route as well to get it into academia's hands. Any other questions?
Hi, hi. I have a question about the environmental impact. We all know these discussions about the LCAs, and they focus mainly on meat, as far as I know. I don't know any peer-reviewed article about LCA discussion about fish. Are we missing that? Are we missing that? Because I think the potential is huge, right, on the environmental level.
I can speak a little bit, though I'm definitely not an expert. But in the current seafood industry, there is some local aquaculture, but not in many species. But a large amount of the seafood is actually imported. And so what this does, for example, if you're a major tuna corporation, you might be catching several millions of pounds somewhere in Southeast Asia that sits on a tanker for X number of days, has to be shipped over to the processing facility, has to be shipped over to the US. And this creates a lot of waste of the food, as well as, environmental impacts in, the large-scale fishing, as well as transport, processing, food waste. And so I think that all of these areas, we have an opportunity to make a big difference in reducing the amount of natural resources used and also creating less waste.
I think there'll be LCAs as the seafood category gets a little further along. I don't think they're there yet. Yeah. But it did make me think of a question I'd had earlier, which was, do the cell-based companies plan on doing human feeding studies, sponsoring them in some fashion? But you guys might not know. All right, well, I'm going to put a bug in everybody's ear that those should be done, especially on everything, plant-based, meat-based. Any other questions?
Hi, I wanted to pick up a little bit the thread that the first guy was talking about with regard to there not being much known on the scientific side compared to land animals. How, I imagine it's a little bit more of an art than a science right now when you compare it to land animal, cell-based meats. And I was curious about what steps you've taken to try to make it more scientific and what protocols you've set up or maybe metrics you're looking at to try to really hone in on how to create these distinct flavor profiles and textures, for example.
Academia. Academia, yeah, the fellow, yeah, you guys need to help. If you look at the produce and the beef industry, they rely heavily on the ag universities, the ag programs, and they've been doing it for decades and decades. Seafood, is, like I said, has only been around for about 30 or 40 years, so there's a lot less out there. But there is. There's, you know, University of Miami is the one growing the mahi-mahi. They're doing snapper. They're doing a lot of different things. University of New England is doing a lot of work in aquaculture. But I would partner with the academics and let them do a lot of the work for you.
I think also in the same notion that the cell-based companies want more funding is that academia needs more funding for seafood, for fish. It's just been very low, and that's one of the problems why these companies don't know a lot, but they're so focused on making the product. So I think it's going to be an art until there's more money here. Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Kathleen. I'm from Perfect Day. I do communications there, and we're a company that kind of tangential to the cell-based meat industry. We make dairy protein without cows through a process of fermentation. And as a communications person, I think a lot about how we engage stakeholders in the dairy industry, and we get a lot of pushback from specifically like dairy producers. So my question is mainly for Chuck, but I'm interested to hear what everybody else has to say as well. What, in your mind, are kind of the inroads with seafood producers or people who are out on boats catching seafood? And then kind of related to that, Chuck, what was it that sparked your interest? Why are you here? And what was it that kind of like made you open to this new technology for producing seafood? Thanks.
Okay, what was the first question? I forgot.
What do you see as the inroads to
Right.
engaging stakeholders and kind of communicating?
Right. Well, first and foremost, you're going to have price. That's going to be a big issue for you. You need to be price competitive. You don't necessarily be lower priced, but if you want mass market appeal, if you want to get major market share, like 50% of the market, you need to be basically equal in price. And then if you're better product for the same price, you're going to win. As far as how to get into the market, I would look at, you have to work with the current structure, the current supply chains. So there's a lot of food service distributors, but I would look at a lot of the specialty distributors. There's specialty foods distributors, KE Foods, Euro USA in Cleveland. A lot of folks, and they do high-end cheeses, they do high-end wines, and they'll do seafood as well. And I think that's one of the areas to do it. The other way to do it is just to go straight to the consumer. They all want to satisfy a consumer taste. So, and that's what I asked those 6 guys. You know, the 2 things they told me the most was, one, it needs to be price competitive. And I'll give you one example of that. Whole Foods was not price competitive, right? When they came out, they were better products, right? Absolutely better products, organic, natural, sustainable, wonderful products. But they topped out at like 5 to 10% market share in their markets. And then they got to a point where they couldn't grow their market share anymore because they got this whole paycheck thought process, and they really tapped out at 5 or 10%. So if you're going to be a lot higher priced, like double the price like a meatless burger is today, you're going to get 5 or 10% of the market. It's going to be your max. But if you want major stuff, you need to do that. And then I would look at the current supply chain, but go to the consumers. Tell the consumers how great this product is, because it is. And that's why I'm supporting this and why I'm interested. I'm trying to learn about it. I'm trying to support the industry any way I can. I'm trying to communicate this to the industry guys that I'm working with to let them know this is the future. Like it or not, those consumers want that. Those millennials they want to know where the product's from. They want to know it's not hurting animals, and this is the best way to do it. So if you guys can get the science right, we can sell it.
You guys, you got your model, your advertising guy right here. Any other questions?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you very much for coming and sharing. Given that for some species, meat is 100% of their sustenance, it's a pretty complicated, amazing compound. At the very least, it's a tissue. By many definitions, it's an organ. So given that tissue organ definition of where we're headed is really what brings value, can you share or speculate about the journey from cells to tissue?
I can start, I guess. So at BlueNalu, one of the things that we focused on from the beginning was, understanding that muscle is a very complex organ. It's made of many different cell types. And so we actually made an effort, even early at the beginning, to isolate multiple cell types. So we actively do, the myoblasts, fibroblasts, also pre-adipocytes, and understand the biology of each individual cell type. And then you have to look at, what is actually the product? What are the key product characteristics, taste, texture, flavor, and how did the different, biological facets contribute to each of those? So do you actually require all of these, or are they just nice to have? And the biggest barrier difference to me is in regenerative medicine, if I'm going to implant that tissue, it has to function exactly as the native organ. However, if you're going to eat a product, you have different endpoints that the consumer is concerned about. And so while we focus a lot on understanding the biology, we also have to keep in mind that the end product is really for the consumer. And so we're just balancing those.
So what are the things we can leave out? Like, I know there's like the bones and eyes and tails and things like that. Are there, like, fish seems like there isn't any bad for me. Like meat, I'd say there's some bad for me's. Is that have it covered the things you might leave out?
When you go to a real fish, there's a lot of waste. No one eats eyes, no one eats guts, so why do you even want to make it? So we focus on the cuts or the parts of the meat that you will want to have, understand the composition of, in terms of what cellular composition and proteins will be present in that piece of, or the cut of the meat that you have, and try to recreate that. It definitely is a long journey from here to there, but we are on the road to it.
What about the skin? I love eating the skin. Sorry. Any possibilities to grow that too?
Skin is definitely an organ. That's a tall order, I think.
Okay, we'll get
Thank
to
you
that'll
very
be
much.
next. Okay, put it on the roadmap. Any other questions? I think we've got some few more.
Thank you, Larissa, and thank you for everyone. This has been a really interesting conversation. I'm Maya from the Good Food Institute, and I guess what I look after public relations and communications and media, and what we're seeing right now is health and processing showing up in the media more and more, particularly related to plant-based meat. I'm curious about like the health, how the technologies we're talking about here, how we can really optimize the health of these products. Chuck, you mentioned that these products will be better than wild. In what ways can we make products that are more healthful, potentially, than the wild equivalent?
I'll start and then give the microphone to Chuck. So there are 3 areas where the product already is inherently better than anything out there in the wild or in the aquaculture, because the products we make, they're inherently free of microplastics. They don't have any heavy metals in them, and in our production process, we don't use any antibiotics. So these 3 aspects of the product already make it better than what is out there. But I'll let Chuck add something.
No, I think you're right. If you can match exactly what you have in the wild or in a farmed fish, I think, and then all those sustainability reasons and all those humane reasons are there, you've got a better product. But there's no reason you couldn't make it better than the wild fish. Why can't you have a higher omega-3 content in your tilapia fillets or whatever you're going to grow? If you're going to grow shrimp, can you put omega-3s in there or things that are good for you to make it actually better than wild in another way?
That's great. Other questions?
Hello. Yes. My name is Ricardo San Martin, and I'm the director of the Ultimate Lab at the UC Berkeley. We've been looking into this space carefully around the scaling up issues. And I have a question for all of you, because we have not been able to sort these numbers out. We have looked at the limited literature there is, and I'm going to give numbers. Sorry, I'm a chemical engineer. So the counts are around 10 to the 11th cells per liter, or 10 to the 10th. You need to go to 10 to the 12th to make it economical. At 10 to the 11th, you run into viscosity issues, and you cannot steer the fermenter. So I was wondering how you're going to sort these things, because we're very curious to know how you're going to scale up beyond what cells can be have in a cell count in a fermenter.
I guess that falls under me. So the 10 to the 11 per mil or 10 to the 10 number that you just gave for the viscosity of it, yes, that's true. You will run into viscosity issues, but in terms of process development, you go from a small vial to a liter to a 5 and 100 or thousands of liters. There are different ways you can make your process. So you'll run into the viscosity issues when you have a batch process, but if you have a perfusion or a fed batch kind of process, you kind of eliminate that issue of viscosity. It will not be perfect. Yeah, if you have high cell density and high cell yield, which is a good problem to have, you'll run into those issues. But if you have a process like a perfusion, I think it's still manageable. I don't know.
Thank you. So it's continuous culture, perfusion, continuous culture? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we've looked into that too, but we can discuss it offline. Okay, thank you.
Hi, this might be a bit of a naive question, and it's not specific to the seafood industry, but one of the reasons for consumer rejection for lab-grown meat is the perception that two pieces of meat are going to be exactly the same, whereas two pieces of natural meat have natural variations and different characteristics. So first of all, is that true, at least on a cellular level, that two pieces of bluefin tuna, for example, are different, whereas two pieces of lab-grown or cell-based bluefin tuna are not the same? And secondly, if that is true, does that mean that to gain consumer acceptance, companies will have to artificially vary different batches of cell-based meat to gain that natural feel?
Do you mean like terroir? So are you asking if the cell-based need to like impose terroir on what they're making?
I don't know what that is, so.
Oh. Yeah, it's just, that the animal tastes like what it's grazing on. We've got a rancher in here, Lauran, who has a 4th generation farm in Tamales, and his animals are going to taste different throughout the year. Are you guys talking about that internally, Mariliis? Maybe you can answer.
I would say that, as you said earlier, the taste of the product will depend on what it eats, and cells also eat all the nutrients. So depending on whether the nutrient supply will always be the same, then the final flavor profile of the cells will change. So if we haven't tested it concretely, but I could imagine that if some of the feedstocks that we use or some of the nutrients that we use come from a different season, they could potentially have an effect on the flavor profile. We haven't confirmed that yet, but I could see the potential there. Maybe not as variable as it is in the traditional meat or seafood industry, but it could still be there.
Yeah, to build on what she said, so there's actually an extensive amount of literature on the nutritional and other profiles of various species at different times, different ages, different seasons of growth, and there is a very, very high variability in the nutritional composition of the fish flesh over seasons. We've done even preliminary sensory analysis testing from the same species from different distributors, and there is a wide variability in, the taste, texture of these, different samples of the same species, but from different sources.
Do you see that as a challenge in terms of consumer acceptance, or no?
I think to some extent, as we were talking about, what is the consumer demand? Certain regions, they might want it buttery. Certain regions might want it more textured. So you have to really assess your consumer market and then develop a product based on the market demand.
Sorry, I just want one more follow-up. I don't mean as different flavor profiles. I mean specifically just the feeling, the yuck factor of this was made in a lab versus this is natural.
That's an entirely different question. Yeah. Sorry. We've got to wrap up, but I wanted to reply to that, which is that seasonal animal products are not marketed as like, this is the winter, blah, 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 right? So that's that's not a focus now, that consumers need to know what the flavor profile is changing season to season. So I don't think that's something, I certainly don't think that's something to message to consumers until decades away. Anyways, we've got to wrap up. My clock is now no longer facing me. It's been really great talking to everybody. I think we'll be milling around, and if anybody has any further questions, thanks so much.